Hey guys, I miss you, just like always. Hope you're doing well and staying healthy and doing everything that you can to keep our world healthy. Okay, last we talked, we were reading Harry Potter and we read chapter 2. And I left a little quiz and some discussion questions up on the Google Classroom, but no one has responded. So I'd like you guys to respond because I think it'll be helpful for us to be able to chat. So I'm not going to go over the discussion questions, but I will talk a little bit about what was in the quiz so that we can kind of see and analyze some of our book. If you want to take the quiz before you finish watching this video, then go for it. Stop your video right now, go in and take the quiz. It's not a difficult quiz and it's not long either. So a couple of the questions, we start out with just some simple comprehension questions of just, do I remember what I read? And the first one was, what is the shape of Harry's scar? Lightning bolt, obviously. Who decided where Harry would live? If we think back to chapter 1, that was Albus Dumbledore decided that he was going to be living with the Dursleys. And then we start to get into some a little bit deeper questions that really analyze our book and aren't just a recall and that like fact memorization of, yep, I remember what I read. So the first one asks, how does Harry feel about living with the Dursleys? And your options were indifferent, awful, joyous, and content. Well, he definitely feels awful. And then he asks, we're asked about evidence to support his point of view or his feeling that it's kind of awful to be in his situation. And that correct piece of evidence is that he lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years, 10 miserable years. And that's found on page 29. And that supports his point of view and his feelings that he doesn't want to be there. But he doesn't really have anywhere else to go. But he does agree that it's a miserable life that he's living. Then you're asked a question about a simile. And if we remember that a simile is a piece of figurative language, it's a comparison that uses like or as. It's a comparison of two different things. It asks us, why does the author use the simile on page 25? He turned around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beet with a mustache. Motorcycles don't fly. So when you're asked about figurative language, it's kind of like being asked about an unfamiliar word or phrase in a text and using your context clues to figure out the meaning of that word or phrase. With figurative language, you want to figure out not only the meaning, what the author meant by the phrase, but you also want to figure out why the author used that phrase. And with figurative language, a lot of times the author uses certain metaphors and similes and personifications in order to better develop their character and to get their reader to better understand their character. Or sometimes their setting or their theme or some specific plot events that they want to emphasize for the reader. And in this case, we're looking at that character development piece, right? He turned around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beet with a mustache. Motorcycles don't fly. Okay, so for me, I'm going to first think about what two things are being compared. His face like a gigantic beet with a mustache. Okay, so his face, which is Mr. Dursley, his face is being compared with a beet and a mustache, basically. A beet with a mustache. So if we think about what a beet looks like and what that might mean for us to compare his face to a beet, well, a beet is often dark purple or red, and it's really, really, really round. And it's really ugly. It's like dirty and almost hairy looking, and it's just ugly. And most of the time, I think, especially for young adults and kids who are reading this book, I mean, do you guys like beets? I like beets, but I think that most kids hear the word beet and they're like, oh, beets. So that creates a connotation in my mind of being gross and ugly. So let's see what our options are on why the author might have included this in. So our first one is to show how angry and irrational Uncle Vernon was. Okay, compared his face to a beet. His face is really red or really purple because he's so angry and he's being pretty ugly. To show that Uncle Vernon was hungry. No, he wasn't hungry. To show how scared Harry was of getting in the car crash. This isn't really about Harry, right? When we think about our figurative language and we think about a comparison, it has to include those two things in it, or at least the character or the main thing that the author's trying to get across to us. And this one doesn't even talk about Uncle Vernon, about Mr. Dursley, so no. And then to show how much Uncle Vernon hated motorcycles. Okay, well, he does yell about how motorcycles don't fly. So this is where I need to think back to Uncle Vernon's motivations. And I think about this whole connection with the whole motorcycle thing and Hagrid at the beginning of the story and Harry's dream and how Harry's life with the Dursleys goes. And so I'm really going to think about that and realize I don't think it's really about motorcycles. The author's not trying to tell me about a motorcycle. The author's trying to tell me about Uncle Vernon and how he reacts and responds to things. So our best answer choice is going to be how angry and irrational Uncle Vernon was. Okay, then we're looking for two details from the chapters that best support the theme that sometimes it's better not to argue, even if it means sacrificing the truth. And we have our options down here if we think, who learned that lesson? Sometimes it's better not to argue, even if it means that you're not telling the truth, even if you're sacrificing the truth. Well, Harry definitely starts to learn that lesson, right? And it's almost like he learns that lesson before we even meet him. Before we even started reading this book, we can see that Harry's learned that lesson. But the author does kind of try to teach us that lesson in showing us that Harry gets in less trouble when he just kind of goes, okay, Uncle Vernon, whatever. Right? When he just kind of lets go and stops caring about it being about himself being honest and just letting it go, right? Okay, so let's look at our details. Harry often gets in trouble with the Dursleys. Well, he does. Harry usually chooses not to argue with the Dursleys, so he stays out of trouble. That definitely supports that theme, right? Sometimes it's better not to argue. Harry doesn't argue so that he doesn't get in trouble. Harry usually gets in trouble with the Dursleys, even though none of the trouble is based in fact. That sounds pretty legitimate. Harry usually gets in trouble with the Dursleys, even though none of the trouble is based in fact. And what does that mean for something to be based in fact? Well, the roots of it are true, right? And the roots of most of the things that Harry gets in trouble for, he doesn't even understand himself, as we saw with that list of kind of previous things that Harry's gotten in trouble for. And then we have, when Harry argues with Dudley, he usually gets beaten up. And Harry decides not to argue with the snake, and then he makes a friend rather than getting in trouble. That last one's kind of silly. The third one, when Harry argues with Dudley, he usually gets beaten up. True, but we don't really have a whole lot of evidence for that. We do hear in chapter 2 how Dudley likes to beat on Harry and how he likes to hit him and punch him and all that stuff. But we don't really get to see that interaction to know if Harry's arguing with him prompted it or if Dudley's just being Dudley. So we don't really have quite enough evidence for that detail to support our theme. But those other details that Harry usually gets in trouble, and he gets in trouble for stuff that's not true or not his fault, those two things definitely support the idea that sometimes it's better to just leave things alone and not argue instead of really, really, really trying to get the truth out. And that's definitely a lesson for all. I think some of my fourth graders hopefully know who I'm looking at. That sometimes you have to let things go, even if it means that you didn't tell the whole entire truth and make everybody understand it. Sometimes it's better just to let it go, because the person that you're trying to talk to is pretty irrational, and they're never going to understand it anyway. Good lesson to learn. Okay, that's it for our chapter 2 response stuff. I'm pretty sure that's it. The last question on the quiz was what other theme could apply. I look forward to seeing your answers if some of you take the quiz. and seeing what themes you think could apply to this book so far. Okay, that's it for chapter 2. Tune in for chapter 3 in a couple minutes.